Hi, so my name is Eli. You can just call me Eli. It's Eli Kimaro, and it is a pleasure to be here with you today. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. And I say that because I really, really hope, I know that this is a lecture series, and so there's a certain expectation that I will come and I will talk and I will share, but I kind of already know my own stories, and for anyone who's seen the movie, you kind of already know some of my own stories as well. Has anyone here had a chance to see the movie yet? Okay, awesome. Okay, so that gives me some idea for how to talk about this film. So great. So what this will be is sort of like, maybe what I'll do is I'll share a little bit of information up front about sort of how I came to make this movie, because I very much see myself as an accidental artist. My background is not as a filmmaker, so I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll show you some clips from the movie. But please, as we're going along, if you have questions, if you have an alternative point of view that you would like to offer up, if you want me to explain something a little bit more or differently, please jump in, because actually how I work best is engaging with people in a dialogue. That's my goal with this movie, is to move it out in the world so we can be using this film as a springboard for deeper conversation, and that conversation is necessarily two-way. I am happy to share what I came ready to share, but broadcasting for me is less interesting than engaging. So please, I really encourage you, if you have any questions at any point, we have time at the end for Q&A, but if you have questions as we're going along, I really encourage you to just ask them, and we'll see where we go from there. Okay, so this film journey began for me, unbeknownst to me, when I was really young. And so my father's from Tanzania, and that is in East Africa. And he was born and raised on a coffee farm on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, which sounds very romantic, at least it did to me. And I got to go back to Tanzania, to the very same farm where he was born and raised, my entire childhood. Every other summer, I would go back there. And so I actually felt very connected to the land. I would get off the plane, and that first hit, the smell of the air was like home to me, right? I really love that feeling in the air of just being back in Tanzania. My connection to the family and the people was a little bit more complicated. Conversely, like, my mom is from Korea, and the story about how they met is in the film, and they tell it much better than I can, so I won't step on their toes there. But just suffice it to say, they both came over to the US on scholarship, and they met in grad school. And they're still together to this day. But my mom's side of the family all settled in the DC area. And I think this might have been before nepotism rules were an issue, because they all seemed to end up getting jobs at the World Bank and the IMF. Like, all of my aunts and uncles had a job there somehow, and both my parents were economists for these branches of the United Nations. And so what that meant for me growing up is that a lot of our family friends were international couples, right? Very interesting mixes: Italian, Somali, Icelandic, Swede, Kenyan, Italian. So very interesting mixes, but they were, and a lot of their kids were mixed race as well. That was kind of a bizarre norm to grow up in, but it was that was my norm growing up, and a lot of them were first-generation American, just like me. So that was our family friends. And then in school, I went to a very small school. It was all-girls school. 3rd through 12th grade, there were 630 students. Really, really small. And everyone knew my parents, right? We knew everyone's parents, you know? We would go over to each other's houses all the time. You knew everyone. So my truth was self-evident. I never had to explain to anyone that I was mixed. I didn't have to go out of my way to make sure they knew that I was mixed or that I was also this. People just knew it, you know? And so I had there were other areas of my life where my identity was more hidden, and I had to or where I had a little bit more conflict. But when it came to being mixed, I had that was just fine for me. Like, there was no noise around that for me, because, I identified as Tanzanian American. I got a little older. I wanted to be a little bit more button pushy-er, so I identified as Mongoloid Negress, see if I could get a rise out of anyone. But it didn't even matter how I identified, because I just knew it was just my own personal truth, and there it was. So race for me didn't come up as an issue so much until I went off to college. And I went to school at a university up in Canada where nobody knew my parents. Nobody knew me. I was just one in a face of 30,000, you know? I went to a sociology class one night, and I was one in the face of 400. And I was the only visible face of color in that room this night. And my sociology professor was a very earnest man, and he was talking this night about the African diaspora. He was really talking about, like, you know, the issues of color privilege within the African American community and the violent mixing of blood between slave owners and their slaves and how it's resulted in the varying shades of brownness and the politics that are associated with that and how it's sort of continued to plague the African American community to this day. And the whole time he's talking, he's looking right at me. And I just started getting hot, you know what I mean? Like, and he's just looking at me, and he's talking to, he's like this, but he's looking right at me. I'm like, why are you looking at me? What? No, what? And it occurred to me that he had this vibe about him, like, don't worry, I got this, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm like, and he was talking at me like he was speaking my personal truth on my behalf. Like, I see you, you know? I see you, I see your shade. I know who you are. I see you. You're not invisible to me, you know? And in that moment, I had never felt more invisible, and I had never felt more exposed. And what I wanted to do was get up and bolt out of that classroom because I was so pissed. But he just kept talking, and I just sat there. I planted, and I just sat there, and I refused to move, and I just held his gaze. And then I got up, and I went home, and that night I was like shaking. I was so livid. And I felt like I just couldn't shake that feeling of like having someone else look at you and just come up with this whole story about who they think you are and what they think your background is, your pedigree is, and what you probably grew up music listening to and eating and considering comfort food, and feeling completely entitled to share their narrative with the rest of the world. You know, like their version of who they think you are. And it was for someone who I've just never had to explain who I am moving through the world. That was a shattering night for me, because it was that moment of realizing, it was like a very crystallized moment of realizing that how I saw myself was not congruent with how other people might see me. And I struggled with that, and I struggled with it all night. I'm an Aries. I like immediate gratification, you know, like I'm gonna figure this out tonight, you know? And so, and I was struggling with it. So what I realized was, you know, in some respects, it does not matter how I personally identify. My personal truth is my personal truth is my personal truth. That's not changing, it's not going anywhere, it's not gonna be any different. But what I realized was, if I am going to be real about what it means, I needed to get real about what it means to also be an African-American Black woman living in this country in this moment in time. That was also now a truth that I had inherited. And so I went back. I was in college, so this is what you do in college, right? You do consciousness raising. So I went back and I reread and I relearned all of my African-American history, the civil rights movement. But this time I read it through a very personal lens, because I realized that this history is necessarily my history because people would assume it to be my history. And everything that I say and everything that I do and every time I show up for an interview or an audition, or whatever it might be, the people are going to be experiencing me possibly through this lens. And so I just need to get real about the fact that that is also in the room with me at all times. And so, you know, I'm not saying that that is the best way to deal with it. That's just how my 22-year-old brain decided to deal with it, like how to make peace with this contradiction that I was experiencing in my life. And so, like, I went on after that, and I pursued, and you know, I actually read up on a lot of things. I read up on the women's rights movement, and I read up on queer liberation movement, and I read about the refugee and immigrant experiences in the U.S., and I majored in psychology so that I could have a framework for understanding my own experiences of abuse that I had experienced when I was a kid. And so, like, for me, that was like what college was all about, was like this massive crash course in consciousness raising. And then I went on and I became a sexual assault and domestic violence crisis counselor. That's what I did. That was my career. I was doing that for like about 12 years. I was doing crisis counseling. I was doing a lot of community organizing, working specifically within different traditionally underserved groups to address issues of violence and oppression that they face in their community. And I was in the middle of doing that work, and I was actually honestly, I was on the verge of burning out from doing that work. And I felt lopsided, like I felt like politically I'd really grown this whole side of my brain that woke up that night after my sociology lecture, like that of like I need to develop, politically I need to develop a queer consciousness, a Black consciousness, a consciousness about the immigrant experience, a consciousness about like gender violence in our, like that whole part of my brain was like it was muscled and huge. And I felt like there's another part of me that was completely atrophying, which was like the personal side of who I am, that personal connection. So I felt like I was sort of out of balance, and I felt like I was out of whack, and I felt like, you know what, it's time for me to shelve the political for a while, and I need to turn my attention back towards the personal. And probably not unrelated to this shift in my life, this is like when I was turning 30, was the fact that I was started to date someone, and I started to date someone seriously. And so my partner is, he was written up in Seattle Weekly. He was described as my white scientist boyfriend. And I'm like, wow, that's awesome, white scientist. That is a moniker. He actually took that and ran with it. So if you type in white scientist at 9elephants.org, this is his email address. And so, but he's a little bit more mixed than that. He's Portuguese, his mom's Portuguese, Irish, Scottish, and French Canadian. By all appearances, he definitely appears to be white. And so, but what I realized was, if we ever decide to have kids, it was going to be up to me to pass down what it meant for them to be Tanzanian. More specifically, what it meant for them to be Chaga. That's the name of my dad's tribe on Mount Kilimanjaro. They are the Chagas. And even though I had gone back there every other summer, I didn't know the first thing about what that meant. I didn't know anything about our songs. Like, I had my idea of what culture was. Like, I didn't know anything about our songs, our dances, our folklore, our traditional healing practices, all of these things that I was raised on a diet of National Geographic, like cultural, anthropological, like documentaries, right? So all the things that I thought of as capital C culture, I didn't know the first thing about what Chaga culture was about. And so it was April in 2003, and I was driving to work one day, and I was listening to this song that came on, and it was sung by this woman, Angelique Kidjo, who has a fantastic voice, and she was singing the song "Summertime," not Will Smith's "Summertime," the Porgy and Bess "Summertime," and it was beautiful. Like, her voice completely transported me back to my summers in Tanzania. And I was listening to it, and I was having this images unfold in my head like a montage sequence in a film, and it was very filmic, and I was remembering the drive from our farmhouse up on Mount Kilimanjaro down into the plains. And when I was a kid, when we would do that drive, guaranteed you would see giraffe, you would see gazelle, you would see zebra, you would see occasionally some elephants. And this isn't driving through national park land, this is just the drive into town. And it's not like that anymore. It's very populated, and so all of the wildlife are now mostly in the national game parks. But like, that was what I remembered about being there, and I had this moment. This is all happening in the period of like 3 minutes of this song. And I had this feeling of like, oh my gosh, like, it's gonna be up to me to pass down my Chaga cultural heritage. And what the hell, I don't know anything. I haven't been paying attention. I had my iPod on the whole time, my headphones. Like, I wasn't listening, I wasn't paying attention, I wasn't curious about anything. I was just there because I had to be there, because that's where we spent our summers, and I wanted to be like away at sleepaway camp with my friends and going to Camp Robin Hood and doing all those things that American kids do, and I felt like I was missing out by going to Mount Kilimanjaro every other summer and going on safari and being in Zanzibar. Wow. But part of what made that whole trip so complicated for me was my connection to my family was very, very strained. And I really had a hard time getting curious about why that was. And because I was a kid, and I was very interested in myself. Apparently I still am, but as a kid even more so, if you can believe it. Okay, so I went back there, and I realized, okay, if probably the best way for me to learn about what this culture is that I have inherited, and this culture is that I will one day pass down to our kids if they ever come along, is to make a movie. I could just go back there and film and sit down with my family and my dad and his siblings and try to get them together and get them to spill the dirt on dad and what he was like as a kid and all that. Like, I could just film those family gatherings and film a little bit about songs and dance and folklore and try to create this cultural picture mosaic about Chaga culture. And because it was playing out in my head like a film, I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I'll just make a video, and like I'll get their stories in their own language, and that'll be it. But it was a home video project, and the reason it was a home video project is because I'd never picked up a camera before. I'd never, ever picked up a camera before. I didn't have any photography skills, but I thought, like, I can go and, it's like the dawn of the digital age, right? So this is in 2003, and people are getting affordable cameras, digital video cameras, where you could make movies, and they look beautiful, and they're affordable. All those tools that were before just in the hands of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and who I thought of as filmmakers growing up, now anyone could make a movie. And I'm like, well, that is awesome. So I signed up for classes at 911 Media Arts Center. And actually, no, wait, I'm jumping ahead. I went home that night after I had this idea of I know what we need to do. I went home and I told my partner, Tom, hey, I think I know what we need to do. We need to go back to Tanzania, and maybe we can just film some video of our family there and get a better understanding of Chaga culture and share that with our future kids. And he's like, awesome. Why don't we just make it worth our while? You know what I mean? Let's make it good. Let's make it at least worth our while so that we get footage that we can watch and not footage that'll make us seasick, And so that's why I signed up for classes at 911 Media Arts Center. And so what we ended up doing was I took some classes, some weekend classes. I took a lighting class. I didn't understand it at all, so I had Tom take that class instead. And he really, he can paint with light. It's so cool. He's a science brain, and he understands how to. I know when something looks the way I want it to look, but he knows how to change it so that he can bend light so it looks the way I want it to look. But if I see something and it's lit, I'm like, it doesn't look right. But he knows how to move things around. I don't know how to do that. So we're a good team, is my point. But then 7 months after I had this idea, we quit our jobs and we bought one-way tickets to Tanzania. We bought just about all of our equipment on eBay, and we took off to Tanzania to see what we would find. And so I'm going to show you a trailer now to give you a little sense of where we went, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more.
I am a first-generation American. Mom and Dad are from opposite ends of the globe. In 1970, only 3 years after interracial marriages became legal, Mom and Dad were married.
I told them the name Kimaro, and they thought, Japanese? I said, no, East African. And that's when alarm bells went off.
My partner and I are also an interracial couple. If our kids were to ever ask me, what am I, Mama? What would I say? I decided to make a film about Dad's tribe on Mount Kilimanjaro. The Chagas. My understanding about my culture was headed for a serious overhaul.
She had this tremendous regret, and in a way a chip on her shoulders, about not having been able to get more education.
It's such a male-dominated society. To get the full picture, I would have to interview women on their own. With the connection I found with these women, I could finally come to terms with my own experiences of abuse.
I'm a lot like you, sing confusion to the night. I'm a lot like you, been right through that foggy light.
really wished I could take this whole experience and shut it in a closet. But my aunts asked me, now that we've shared our stories with you, what are you going to do about it?
Thank you. You know, that last, I love that in the trailer, the last thing that you hear is my aunts. It almost felt like a commandment of me, right? Of now that we've shared our stories with you, what are you going to do about it? Because leaving Tanzania, that was the one line that I couldn't let go of. And it complicated things for many different reasons. One is because when I went back to Tanzania, while I was back there in 2004, we were there for 9 months, the movie I was trying to make was about Dad. I was trying to tell Dad's story. Dad had come over when he was 19, and he lived in the US for 40 years, and then he was moving back. And my mom was moving back too, moving there for the second time actually. I need a tissue. Does anyone have a tissue? And so my dad was moving, so I was trying to make a movie of my dad moving back to Tanzania and try to fit back in with the family and culture he left behind 40 years earlier, you know? And the film actually that I thought I was making was called Worlds Apart. And so this whole notion that, you know, we went from a film called Worlds Apart to A Lot Like You is really the journey that I took with this film, as I sort of realized that in order to do right by my aunt's stories and in order to do it justice, I had to find a way to take ownership of the story and tell it from my point of view. And the reason is because, one, I was not at all qualified to tell my dad's story. That's not my story to tell. And two, every time I tried to take a dramatic turn with it or have an interesting reveal, thank you, nothing's going on here. Every time, like, you know, he's just so much smarter than me, my dad. And so he could see where I was coming from a mile away. You know, he was working for the IMF, and I thought, oh, isn't this an interesting expose? He's an agent of globalization, and then he returns home, and his culture's disappearing. Let's take that angle, you know? And he's like, nope, you know? And so, you know, it wasn't my story to tell. And so what I ended up doing was, you know, I sat down and I had a conversation with Mom and Dad. It was a very tough conversation where I sort of asked them, you know, did you know that this was the reality of my aunt's experiences? Did you know these stories before I sat down with them? Because I went into the conversations completely blind, and the stories they shared with me completely, all my filmmaking came to a screeching halt when I got their stories. You know, I wasn't prepared. I wasn't aware that the practices that they talk about and the experiences that they went through was like a part of our culture. Not only like a violence that was like normalized within our family, but it was also part of our family's culture. And you know, that's the lens that I bring to the world. I was an activist. I was a gender violence activist. I saw rape and domestic violence in everything. You know these people, right? And that was me. And I was heightened, and I had my own experiences of it, and I was very perceptive, and I could pick up on it. And I went back there every other summer, and I had no idea that this is the reality of the women in my family. And that was very shocking to me. And for many different reasons, it brought my whole film journey to a screeching halt. But I did sit down and I talked to Mom and Dad about it. And I don't want to give too much of it away. The conversation actually, it's probably the most deconstructed scene in the film. Do you know the scene I'm talking about? The scene where Mom and Dad are talking? No, okay. So it's the scene that sort of like probably is the climax of the film. It's just the two of them talking about their different understanding of my aunt's experience. But what I realized was like I just needed to take ownership of this story. And that was really hard to do because the last thing I wanted to be was a first-time filmmaker making a story about my own life because who would care, you know? And I just really, you know, I thought for some reason telling my dad's story, it's an experience that people could plug into and understand. Immigrants coming to this country and then feeling like an outsider here, but then the possibly even harder experience of feeling like an outsider when you return home. I thought that might be a story that people could really relate to. But my experience as a queer mixed first-generation American growing up in this country and going back to uncover my roots, I thought, I'm like, okay, that's going to matter to me and my daughter. And but what we found was the more personal we got in our storytelling, the more honest and truthful and vulnerable we allowed ourselves to be in our storytelling, the more people were able to see aspects of themselves, aspects of their family reflected back at them from the screen. And as a first-time filmmaker, that has been very powerful to me. When I get up and I talk to an audience who hasn't seen the film, it's very interesting because like I can introduce the film and then we sit down and 80 minutes later I get back up and I stand up in front of the audience and I'm ready to connect and do Q&A. And my daughter can feel this. She's 6 now. She can feel it, the difference in the room before I even open my mouth. There's a quality of care and humility and vulnerability that people bring to our conversation after the film that is exquisite. And it is such an honor to be a part of, you know? And it is a quality of connection that is amazing to me. And what this film is doing, actually, I have realized, is that it is making my truth self-evident to the world. So I don't like small talk. I'm not good at it. I don't really want to cultivate the skills to develop it. Like I don't like small talk. You know, I like connecting with people. And I think the thing that's so amazing is that like people see this film, they see a very personal story. They see a lot of truth telling that happens in the story. And what they bring me afterwards is the truth of their own stories. And I can never predict where those are going to come from. They come from all over the place. And it is so amazing to connect with people on that level, right? Because think about it. We are all here because of our stories, right? Think about all the random life choices you made today, all the detours you have taken in your life that led you to be here at Edmonds Community College, that led us all to be together in this room today, let alone that your parents made, let alone that your grandparents made, let alone that your ancestors made, so that we could all be here in this room together today. That is extraordinary. And to get a glimpse into what some of those stories are after we show the film and to be able to connect with people on that level is just, it's a gift that this film is giving me that I was not expecting, you know? And it's actually also something that we invite people to share with us. So, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to make a footnote in my brain to come back to this point later so that I can go back to the story. And I don't know if that's going to work because my memory's getting really bad. So hopefully by saying out loud, I'll remember. Okay, so the other thing that I want to talk about is actually I want to share a little bit about what happened in that conversation with my aunts. Not what they share with me, because that's not my story to share with you. It's their story to share. So I don't want to sort of step on their toes. But what I do want to tell you is, you know, they shared, my aunts and I did not have a warm relationship going into that conversation. In fact, I had always experienced a lot of resentment and tension. I'd always struggled a lot with the incredible levels of poverty that existed in my family, and as a kid, it was hard to make sense of that, right? Privilege that you don't ask for, but you benefit from, is hard enough for grown-ups to wrap their brain around, right? But as a 4-year-old kid playing in my front yard and having my aunts and uncles pull me aside and tell me that they are hungry and ask me for food and ask me for a car or $100 and then asking me not to tell my parents was really, really hard to process. And my aunts brought to that an additional layer of entitlement and anger and resentment that I didn't understand. And after making this film, I understand. And I think one of the things that this film allowed me to do, one of the things that the camera allowed me to do, was to capitalize on my cultural insider-outsider status, right? I was insider enough that I had access to these people, their family, my dad and his siblings. He's the youngest of 6. I was able to sit down with them and talk with them. But I was outsider enough not to know, not to ask certain questions. So people always ask me, how did you get your aunts to open up to you? How did you get at those stories? And the answer to that question, I'm still trying to figure out. So basically, I just sat down and I asked all of my dad's siblings. Can you talk about, like, you know, what were the milestones in your life and rites of passage, and what do you remember about, like, growing up and your chores and going to school, and how did you do, and, you know, how did you get married and all this sort of stuff? What was your coming of age ritual? I got my license. What did you do? You know what I mean? Like, and so, like, you know, just trying to understand, like, sort of what their sort of life has been like. And I think if I were raised on Mount Kilimanjaro, I would know enough not to ask that question of the women in my family. But I didn't. And so I just came right out and I asked them, can you tell me about how you got married? What was that like, you know? I had read this whole 2-week ritual exchange of beers that happens between, like, prospective families, and Tom and I read that and we're like, whoo, that's gonna be the chaga section of our ceremony, you know what I mean? And we brewed beer and we exchanged it, and that was awesome. And then, you know, like, I go back there and then I unpack stories about what that wedding ritual actually entailed. And it entailed, shoot, I'm really going down a rabbit hole here. I'm talking about it, but I'm not talking about it. At the very least, what it entailed was kidnapping and rape of women as a means of getting married. Like, that's what you do. You kidnap a woman that you want to get married to, and, like, through the act of sexual assault, she now cannot go back to her family. She's necessarily your property now and your responsibility, and that is how these women entered into the institution of marriage, and I did not know that. And so then all of a sudden I'm going back and I'm thinking about my own wedding, and I'm thinking, so what was that exchange of beer really all about? And I'm having that horrible feeling that you get when you realize that maybe in some way, in an unknowing, completely misguided but well-meaning way, I was capitalizing on some aspect of my culture that I didn't really fully understand. And I was romanticizing a culture that I didn't really fully understand. And now I have a more thought out, a fully realized understanding of what that marriage ritual was about. But I really, really struggled with that for a long time, because I realized that in my own way, I was a little bit, I was complicit in the ignorance that was going on. And I felt a little bit like that sociology professor who had their own understanding of Chaga culture and felt like, you know, like, oh, and I'm going to share this culture now with my community of friends here in the US, and we're going to, like, do this ceremony that was a part of the traditional Chaga wedding ceremony. And then just realizing, you know, years later, oh gosh, what was I perpetuating without thinking about it, you know? And so, yes, that's a great question. And thank you so much for being the first one to ask a question. I know that's not easy, and I'm very grateful. You know, yes, it is. I think it has taken a different form. I think that what I have heard of, so one of the things that happened was in the movie, I hear these stories and then I just shut down. I can't even go any further. And if I had a journalistic background, or if I had a journalistic bone in my body, I might have asked a woman who was younger than 80 if this was still happening. I might have asked my cousins or my cousins' kids or anyone, but I didn't. I stopped where I was, and I had to sort of come to terms with that afterwards. But yes, it is still happening. And what ends up happening is, you know, a lot of girls who are going to school, who are walking to school, they are doing that at great risk, because a lot of times they can be kidnapped and sexually assaulted, and they get pregnant. They have to drop out of school, they no longer have access to education, and they get married. And so that's what people are finding a lot, is like what they call school-age pregnancies now. So it's changed a little bit. Like, it's not so much maybe used as a norm for getting married, but this is still a practice that is happening with the same result. So in my eyes, nothing has changed. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Please. See, I like answering questions, because then I know where you guys are at. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. I believe, so you are going to get a link to see the film. It'll have a password. It's on my Vimeo page. And so on the way out, please make sure to get the information about the link, and you'll be able to see it. I'll keep the link active through this weekend, so you can watch it. You can watch it, yeah. And I think also Edmonds Community College, I think they might have also gotten the DVD. So I don't know what your library rental system is too, but you'll be able to watch the DVD, and that has all the special features on it and everything, because I am going into this knowing that I'm a one-hit wonder, you see. So I packed it full of like, here's my audio commentary, and then here's some deleted scenes, and then here's an interview. And so if you want to subject yourself to that, you can. Any other questions? I can keep going. I can keep talking forever. Yes? Can you speak your native language? Kichaga? No, I can't. So I had my cousin who was there who was translating. So when we interviewed the women, it was just the women. And so I had someone there who could help me understand what was happening. This is the thing that was very interesting, though, because I understand Swahili. Swahili is a national language along with English. I can understand that well enough as we're going along to sort of be able to follow along with the conversation and even like sort of add to it. But, you know, when my aunts were telling me the story of what they went through, in my mind, being a psych major, still very green, it's like they went back to the language of their id. You know what I mean? Like they were giving voice to an experience that they had that they'd never spoken about before. And so they went from talking in Swahili to Kichaga. And I don't have low expectations of what I'm capable of, but I know that I will never be able to speak Kichaga. And here's why. Because Kichaga is a language that you can understand the words, and you can study it, and it's not written, so you have to be there and immerse yourself in it. I can hardly pronounce my name. My name's a Kichaga name, and my dad spent 20 minutes trying to get me to pronounce my name right, and I don't think I remember how to do it now. But you know what I mean? Like, but it's a very challenging language to speak. It's not written. But the other thing is they speak in metaphors all the time. So you can think that you're following along. You can be fluent in Kichaga. You can think you're following along in a conversation, and it makes total sense, but they're talking about it here. They're talking about cooking and cleaning up after yourself and all that sort of stuff. And it's what they're actually talking about is down here. So even if you speak the language completely fluently and have your entire life, you could be a part of a conversation and have no idea what's going on. So for many reasons, I think I will never master Kichaga. But I do want to at least get conversational in it. That's my responsibility, to be able to do what I can to connect with family members in that way. And my Kichaga's rudimentary at best. So, is that a hand? No. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Okay. So the thing about my aunts and hearing their stories and bearing witness to their stories is, and I think I'm going to actually pull up one more image up here, if that's okay, in just a minute. You see in the movie a conversation where one of my aunts she's particularly outspoken, and she's pretty angry. She's pretty bitter, and she's sitting on the porch, and she's talking about how the anger and the resentment she's carried around her entire life for having had her education passed over for my dad's. And at one point, she even looks over at him and she says, you know, if there were justice in this world, I would be the one traveling all over the world. I would be the one traveling all over the world. I would be the one living in this big house, and then you would come to my house, and I would come to receive you. And she's looking right at him, you know, and she's like, and it's just intense, you know? And she's angry, and she looks weathered, and she looks beaten down by life, but she's still fighting, you know? The very next day, I sat down in the hut with my two aunts. I talked to them together because I did not have a particularly warm relationship with them. I did not want to go through the experience twice, and I thought that they would work really well off of each other. Even though they hated each other, that still, like, you know, they would spark each other's memories, and they went through life as the girls. They were the only two girls in the family, and they're always the girls, and so they went through a lot of things together, and I thought maybe they'd be able to sort of spark each other's memories. So I interviewed them both together. And in that conversation, they shared with me these stories that they had never even shared with each other as sisters, right? Which was very surprising to me because I did not have a warm, loving connection with my aunts. It wasn't like, now sit down, my child, and we will finally tell you the story that we've been wanting to tell you your whole life. I just blindly asked them, so can you tell me, like, what was it like when you were growing up? What was it like getting married? Can you tell me what that experience was like? And they must have been a beat where they just decided, do we tell them what, like, the standard story, or do we actually take this moment and really tell her what that experience was like for us? And they both decided to just speak their truth. And it was a very powerful moment for me because even though they're speaking in Kichaga, well, my aunts are very expressive, and so I could see what was happening. You know, they were like mimicking like being strangled and dragged down the road and raped. I mean, it's just the way they're describing it is so you can feel it in the way they're talking too. You know, you don't need to speak a language to like understand sort of what's being communicated. And so I'm hearing their stories, and I have 12 years of supporting survivors of rape and domestic violence. I'm very seasoned at it, and I know. I might, you know, like I haven't done it in a while, but I know how to show up with a quality of presence that at least allows folks to be heard and to be able to sort of like direct them to where they might need to go to get some support, right? I can do that. But with my aunts who were speaking to me in Kichaga, I had no language. All of my advocacy-based counseling language does not exist for me in Kichaga. I can't access it. So all I was able to do when my aunts started sharing their stories was to create the space where they could share their stories with me and just bear silent witness to the fact that they had led a life of unspeakable suffering and were finally having the opportunity to share it. And so I did nothing but bear silent witness to their stories. And just that was enough to transform them. And so I think what I learned from my aunts when they said, you know, now that we've shared our story with you, what are you going to do with it? That was a commandment to me, and it was something that took me about 8 years to figure out what I was supposed to do with it. And so what my goal is with this film is to move it out in a way where people can use this film, use this personal story as a springboard for having deeper conversations about race, about class, about identity, about culture, about migration, about how oppression compromises the humanity in us all. I mean, about all of these different issues. You know, so we're partnering with nonprofit organizations who are working on these issues, who can use this film to further their organizational missions. I'm sort of moving out in the world of campuses and conferences and lectures, but mostly what I'm interested in doing is just connecting with audiences, offering this film as a tool for having these conversations internally within our family. You know, my dad has seen the film, and there's stuff that is revealed in the film about my own experiences when I was a child that I never shared with him. And this film, through this film, he now knows, now as he puts it, now we have no rocks left to hide under. This film is doing its work out in the community, but internally within our family, it is forcing us to have conversations that can only make us stronger as a family. And so even though my dad, is the person that people go on the biggest roller coaster ride with, you have to fall in love with my parents in the first half of the film. I'll tell you very flat out, that's my strategy. You need to be in love with mom and dad for the first half of the movie, because where we go in the second half is a little bit challenging, and you need to be rooting for both of them to be able to get through that. And I want people to be sitting with feelings of tension. I don't want it to be easy. I don't want someone to be a good guy and someone to be a bad guy. And my dad recognizes that, in the course of the film, he anchors some conversations in some pretty challenging places, but he sees that it's serving a bigger purpose out in the world. And he's able to show up in a way that's just sort of supporting the work I'm trying to do with the film. And I hope that you will be interested in checking it out. And what I want to offer you is, our goal of engaging with audiences. One of the things that we're doing is we have a postcard campaign. And so we invite people to share sort of their thoughts, their reflections, the stories that this film evoked for them on our website, on alotlikeyoumovie.com. If you go to Get Involved, there's an ally project, and it's actually been written up quite a bit, which is exciting for us. And it's just basically an invitation for you to add your voice to the conversation. Because, our most recent submission was from someone who was raised in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which apparently is a hotbed for the KKK. I did not know this, but he shared that with me, and he grew up very much immersed and surrounded by that community, and he married a woman from northern Uganda, and he's just amazed at how common their values are and the life that they've been able to build together, and wonders how did that happen? How do we come from such different worlds and still manage to sort of come together? That's a story that's got to go back generations, you know? And so, like, the most surprising people are finding the most unlikely connections with our film, and it's amazing. It's just the power of story and the story that people bring us in response. So I invite you to participate in that if you feel inclined to just sort of add your voice to that conversation and to find us and to connect with us, because I'd love to hear where this film journey takes you. So I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but are we pretty much right there? Any time for questions? Okay. Any questions now? Yes. Yeah. I mean, because here I would know, like, New Beginnings. Where are you located? Here's the people. Here's where you can go. Like, here's how I can plug you into your network of support. You know, yeah, you're right. Like, I think there was a slight feeling of helplessness, but there was also a transformation that happened in real time over the course of our conversation, where I realized that just having the space to tell their story uninterrupted, to know that they were heard and to know that they were believed, was most of what they needed in order to be able to move on with their lives. And they said as much, you know what I mean? And I saw this to be true when I went back to Tanzania in this past Christmas. I went back to Tanzania with my daughter and my husband this past Christmas, and my dad said, you know, I want to do a screening. I think my dad was a little bit like, yeah, big shot, you know, moving around the world, showing this film. Let's show it right here at home and see how that goes. I mean, he didn't really have that kind of attitude, but I had a feeling that was kind of a little bit behind it. And so we had a screening for the family, and what I didn't realize was my aunt was there with her abusive husband. Her abusive husband came to Christmas dinner. I'd never met him before, but there he was. And I recognized his name, and I shook his hand. I'm like, oh, it's a bold move. Coming over to eat some of our food. Okay, well, hey, welcome, you know, and that started at 2, because this is Tanzania, you know, so people come over at 2 and they stay until like 11, you know. And so we ate all day, and then, like, you know, friends and neighbors went home, and we had a screening for the family of the film. And my uncle stayed. And I was like, wow, okay, this is really intense. And so my aunt was there, and I actually couldn't sit through the screening because I would have been reading the backs of their heads and the body language, and I would have driven myself crazy. But I'm like, but I'll be damned if I don't show up for the conversation that follows, right? Like, I'm going to show up for that conversation. So when the film was done, I came out, and it was a Q&A, but mostly I was the one with the question, which is like, do you feel like we did right by your stories? Do you feel like we shared your stories in the spirit in which you share them with us? Because when you walk away with 80 hours of footage and you go into an editing suite halfway around the world and you're trying to craft a story, there was always a little part of me that was worried, like, did I exploit this for dramatic purpose? You know what I mean? Like, did I make something more of this than was actually there just to sort of, for dramatic effect? Am I, like, exploiting this? Like, and I didn't feel like I was. That was always my litmus. Like, I would ask myself that, and I would always, like, I feel like the story we ended up telling was very grounded in what the actual experience was. But my aunt was the first one to stand up. And her husband was sitting right there. And so I asked him, like, do you feel like we did right by you? And she stood up, and she'd clearly been crying watching the movie. And she said, as clear as day, this is 8 years after we sat in the hut. She's like, she reiterated everything that she said. And she's like, you know, there up on the screen, we were 2. And now I'm just 1. And I'm so grateful that I don't have to be the only one carrying those stories around with me anymore. Like, I really never thought that I would find the day when I could sit down with someone and speak my truth and be heard and to be able to let go of that burden I've been carrying with my whole life. And being able to sit in that room, in that hut with you, I felt like I was able to let that go. And now I'm able to live my life, you know, relieved of that burden that I had been carrying that whole time. And I didn't realize that I was waiting to hear those words, but I was, because I could feel like something completely released in me when I heard her say that, you know? And so so I think that, yeah, I don't know. I think that sometimes just hearing someone and listening to them and giving them the space to share their story can be all they need to help them move on to the next thing. And I think for my aunts, that was not a resource they had access to. Yes. I don't think so. And the reason is because I think, you know, everyone in the community, I think, knows that this is a practice that happens. How it goes down, individually might vary. But here's the thing that I noticed because I asked my uncles the way I asked my aunts, like, how did you get married, right? And what I noticed was none of the men were getting bigger from that story. None of the men were bragging about how their wife was like so feisty that they needed to get 5 of their friends or 10 of their friends to get them. You know what I mean? Like, no one was bragging about it. No one was getting bigger as a result of the story. So there was like a cultural silence that was sort of like keeping it silent and keeping the practice going. You know what I mean? Like, because the men weren't talking about it and the women weren't talking about it. And so that was when I noticed, like really oppression does compromise the humanity in all of us. Like, because men were struggling and I think there was a reason why men were being silent, and I think it had to do a lot with the shame as well. I mean, they knew this wasn't something that was like bravado and machismo and something to brag about, So there was no consequence for my uncle, because he wasn't the only one. Yeah. I think what it's done around the culture around men is to get them to start talking. You know what I mean? Like, it's breaking the silence. And I'm not breaking the silence, my aunts are breaking the silence. I'm just sort of the conduit of that. The thing that was amazing to me is, like, I interviewed 2 of the women together in the hut, but then I interviewed like about 4 other women separately on separate days. They had no idea what anyone else had talked about. And I mean, they were all older, but they were all also it was like a tipping point. Like, all of them just shared the truth of what they went through. Like, even though it was going against the cultural norms, they just realized, you know what? I have no reason to hide this anymore. I'm just going to tell it like it was. And so I actually got all the women sharing the truth of how they went through their experience, like their experience of getting married, and all the men were like very tight-lipped and telling me a script about what the chaga wedding ceremony is, So it was an interesting moment to capture. I think it's that kind of being able to see the societal or cultural shift. It takes a little bit of time to see, but there are support groups that are starting to emerge, right? There are conversations that are starting to emerge. Here's one more quick story. I know you guys are like in the middle of midterms, and I can't believe you're still hanging with me, and I'm very, very grateful. I'll share one more quick story. This might be a good way to end it. So my aunt who passed away, she has a younger son, right? Her youngest son is a pastor in the village. Very sweet, very well respected, and he has his own parish. And so he came to see this movie. I wasn't there. I told my mom, this movie is done. I want to use it as a tool for activism. If you can use it to support your development work that you're doing, in any way, all the money that you raise from screenings can go towards that. Building a girls' dorm, the microfinance project for women in the market, running water and sanitation to all the schools in the village, all of their work that they're doing now in Tanzania, fund it. Like, it just goes to that. So my mom took that idea and she ran with it, right? So she started doing these screenings, and I'm like, again, I wanted to be able to shepherd it a little bit, but she just ran with it. So I'm like, okay, this film's on its own course. My aunt's youngest son, pastor, came to the first screening in Tanzania. It is the first time that he was hearing his mom's stories about how she got married, right? I warned Mom, and I said, Mom, you got to be really careful about this, because this is going to be really intense, and it's going to be very, very personal, and we need to make sure. I wanted him to have his own private screening of it, but he was coming to this thing, and it was like this train that's moving. I can't, you know what I mean? And so I'm like, but what he ended up doing was he ended up staying with my mom overnight. My parents, he stayed with them overnight and was with them the following morning. But he's a pastor, so he has a certain ability to sort of hold it together. So he held it together at the screening. He went home with my parents, and he cried, and he cried, and he cried. And it wasn't the first time he heard this story, because he's a pastor, and he knows that this is something that's still happening. This is something that girls are experiencing, girls having their education passed over, girls being, kidnapped and raped on the way into school. I mean, he's hearing these stories. He'd never heard it from his mom, and she's talking about his dad. And so, and she's passed away, so he's hearing her voice, not only having the very powerful experience of hearing her voice and seeing her after she's passed away, which is something that folks in Tanzania don't necessarily get to do, but hearing this story for the first time was very impactful. And so that night, actually, my mom told me, he said very clearly, it is now very clear to me what I need to do, what my mission is and what my goal is. And my goal is to use my pulpit and my practice to make sure that all girls have equal access to education, and to make sure that women and girls are allowed to grow up and live in houses that are free from violence and abuse. And that's what he's doing. You know what I mean? Have we seen the change that's resulted from that yet? I don't know. Probably not. But that is, I mean, like, but it's coming. You know what I mean? It's coming. So, thank you. Thank you.